The sheer brutality of the fighting at Wandiwash, the desperate volleys, the clash of bayonets in the dust, was, on a purely local level, a fight for a small fort, a few hundred square miles of coastline, and the control of trade revenue. But zoom out from the desperate pleas and the bloody mud, and you see that the battle was merely a single, furious pawn sacrifice in the greatest, most devastating conflict the world had yet witnessed, the 7 Years' War. This was not just a European war. It was a truly global conflagration, a terrifying struggle for imperial supremacy fought across 5 continents: Europe, North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. It was, as Winston Churchill would later call it, the first true World War. The fighting in the Carnatic was inextricably linked to the struggle in the freezing forests of Brandenburg, the misty plains of Quebec, and the sugar islands of the Caribbean. The fate of an Austrian duchy mattered to the price of tea in London, and the control of a minor Indian port dictated the fate of New France. In the European theatre, the war was defined by the relentless struggle of Frederick the Great of Prussia against a crushing alliance of France, Austria, and Russia. Britain, Prussia's sole major ally, understood that to keep France preoccupied and drain its resources in Europe, they must strike at the heart of French global finance, their colonies and their trade networks. The British strategy, conceived by the visionary statesman William Pitt the Elder, was a masterpiece of geopolitical calculation. It was a maritime and colonial strategy. Use the Royal Navy to isolate France and seize her richest overseas possessions. And of all those possessions, the Indian subcontinent, the source of cotton, spices, opium, and the vast, unimaginable profits of the East India Companies, was the ultimate prize. For the French, India was a jewel that promised to secure their monarchy's financial future and cement their global dominance. Their representative, the Comte de Lally, was not simply a company official. He was a lieutenant general of the Royal French Army, sent with explicit instructions from Versailles to sweep the British from the map. He represented the full, centralized power of the French crown, contrasting sharply with the British, whose military operations in India were often hamstrung by the conflicting agendas of company merchants and naval officers. Lally's objective was to capture Madras, the capital of British power in the south, and expel the Redcoats entirely. And for a terrifying period leading up to Wandiwash, he very nearly succeeded. News of French victories, the successful sieges, the crushing of British-backed local rulers, the seemingly unstoppable advance of Lally's forces, sent waves of panic rolling across the Indian Ocean and into London. The loss of India would have been an economic cataclysm. It would have meant a £2 million annual deficit for the East India Company, the collapse of their credit, and the catastrophic weakening of Britain's ability to prosecute the war in the West. Conversely, a French victory in India would inject a massive stream of wealth directly into the French war machine, strengthening their navy, financing their allies, and potentially tilting the entire global balance of power against the beleaguered British. This was the terrifying reality facing Eyre Coote and his men. They were not fighting for glory alone. They were the thin, sweaty line of defense for the entire British global strategy. The war in India, the Third Carnatic War, was therefore the financial linchpin of the 7 Years' War. It was a proxy conflict fought between two immense corporate military entities, but the consequences were regal. Victory here secured the largest economic engine in the world for one side and condemned the other to strategic failure. When Eyre Coote took command, the general consensus, from the counting houses of London to the barracks of Madras, was that Britain was losing the grand chessboard of the 7 Years' War in the East. Lally had the superior numbers, the strategic position, and, critically, the momentum. The problem facing Coote was not just military, it was existential. He had to reverse a tide that had been flowing against him for years, against a man who believed, with excellent reason, that India was already his. The stakes were not merely high, they were impossible. The arrival of Eyre Coote in India was not greeted with fanfare or confident expectation. It was met with the heavy, pervasive atmosphere of imminent collapse. He was taking command not of a rising force, but of a retreating, demoralized remnant, bruised by a relentless series of defeats that had, by 1759, brought the British East India Company to its knees. To understand Coote's monumental achievement at Wandiwash, one must first grasp the terrifying efficiency of the man who had nearly won the subcontinent for France, Thomas Arthur, Comte de Lally. Lally was a figure of complex and contradictory brilliance. An Irish Jacobite who had risen through the French ranks, he was intensely ambitious, utterly fearless, and possessed a driving strategic vision that transcended mere colonial squabbling. Unlike his predecessors, Lally arrived in 1758 with a mandate from Versailles to fight a war of annihilation. He did not seek to outtrade the British, he sought to expel them entirely. Lally's initial campaign was a masterpiece of speed and aggression. His forces, spearheaded by disciplined French regulars, immediately seized the strategic port of Cuddalore and the key British stronghold of Fort St. David. These were not minor losses. They were devastating blows to British prestige and military capability in the south. The capture of Fort St. David was a psychological watershed, demonstrating that the French were now capable of prosecuting successful large-scale sieges, a level of warfare the British had hoped to avoid. The true moment of terror for the British came with the siege of Madras itself, beginning in December 1758. Madras was the very heart of the British commercial and administrative enterprise in the south, guarded by the massive Fort St. George. Lally threw his entire army at it, besieging the fort with a ruthless determination rarely seen in the Carnatic. For nearly 2 months, the British garrison was trapped, facing constant bombardment and the real possibility of starvation and surrender. The French occupation of the surrounding city was complete. The British military leadership, crippled by indecision and personal rivalries, offered no effective relief. The defense was desperate, a feat of sheer endurance rather than tactical brilliance. It was only the sudden, crucial arrival of a powerful British naval squadron, commanded by Vice Admiral Pocock, carrying reinforcements and supplies, that compelled Lally to lift the siege in February 1759. Lally had failed to take Fort St. George, but the strategic damage was done. The British had been exposed as vulnerable and dependent on external naval power. The vast majority of British territory in the Carnatic had fallen under French or French-aligned control. The French had cultivated powerful alliances with local rulers, most notably the Nawab of Arcot, and their military prestige among the Indian princes was at its zenith. The narrative across the region was clear: the French were winning. This relentless campaign had secured the strategic depth and resources for Lally to prosecute the final phase of his war. He controlled the ports, he controlled the hinterlands, and crucially, he had severely eroded the morale of the British company forces. When Coote landed, he found an army deeply scarred by the knowledge of how close they had come to total defeat at Madras. Lally's genius lay in his ability to mobilize superior forces and deploy European-style siege warfare with devastating effect. He was not defeated by a counterattack, he was repelled by the sea. This left him still in possession of the field, still with the vast majority of his army intact, and still fully committed to the task of permanent British expulsion. Coote's arrival, therefore, was not the start of a new, aggressive campaign, but a last-ditch attempt to shore up a defense that was already crumbling under the weight of French victory. He was walking onto a stage where the preceding acts had already delivered a French triumph, and he had mere weeks to rewrite the entire script. The series of French victories, culminating in the near loss of Madras, triggered more than just military panic. It ignited an existential financial crisis within the East India Company, the sprawling corporate behemoth that was, in essence, an empire in its own right. The company was not merely a passive trader, it was the financial engine of Britain's global ambitions, a sprawling network of credit, commerce, and political influence that underpinned the nation's ability to wage the 7 Years' War. The price of failure in India was not just a diplomatic setback, it was the collapse of the entire structure of British credit. In London, the news from the Carnatic sent shockwaves through the counting houses of the city. Company stock plunged dramatically. Investors who had poured millions into the promise of vast Indian profits saw their fortunes evaporate. The board of directors, a body of powerful merchants rather than soldiers, faced an unprecedented crisis of confidence. The immediate fear was not just the loss of revenue from textiles and spices, but the failure of the entire system of country trade, the immensely profitable network of inter-Asian commerce controlled by the British from their bases. If the French controlled the key ports, this entire flow of wealth would be instantly choked off. The company's vulnerability was structural. Their armies and infrastructure were financed by high-interest loans raised on the back of expected revenues. With Lally's success, that revenue stream had become hypothetical. The financial domino effect was terrifying. If the French could not be stopped, the company would default on its massive debt. A major default by the East India Company would have been equivalent to a national banking crisis, potentially destabilizing the government and forcing Britain to withdraw funds and troops from the crucial European theatre of the 7 Years' War. In short, the military crisis in India threatened to collapse William Pitt's entire strategy. The company's desperation manifested in two critical ways. Firstly, they rushed whatever meager, late reinforcements they could muster to the subcontinent, often recruiting men of dubious quality and shipping them under difficult conditions. These were not the vast, organized forces of a European state. They were corporate reinforcements, a frantic attempt to inject enough capital, in the form of fighting men, to stem the hemorrhage. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the strategic calculus changed entirely. The objective shifted from maximizing profit to survival. Every resource, every available coin, and every man had to be thrown behind the immediate defense of the last remaining strongholds. The failure to decisively relieve Madras had proven that a purely defensive strategy was insufficient. They needed a bold, aggressive counterstroke that could not only halt Lally but permanently break his army. The general who succeeded, or failed, in this task was to become the walking embodiment of the company's financial and political future. They were not looking for a cautious defender. They needed a gambler, a man capable of pulling off a strategic miracle that would instantly restore investor confidence and assure the courts of Europe that Britain's financial engine was still running. Eyre Coote, then, was thrust into the role of the company's last, best, and most fragile hope. He carried not just a sword, but the credit ratings of the entire British Empire on his shoulders. The fear and exhaustion of the troops he commanded were mirrored by the terror in the boardrooms of London. The political and economic elites understood that if the thin red line broke at Wandiwash, the British financial pillar would shatter, and the war for global supremacy, already fiercely contested, would tilt decisively and probably irreversibly into France's favor. The man entrusted with arresting the collapse of the British presence in India was not an aristocrat of the highest order, nor a celebrated hero of previous European campaigns. Eyre Coote was an Irishman, a product of the mid-18th century military meritocracy, whose character was forged in the grinding, often unglamorous, service of a corporate army thousands of miles from the fanfare of London. He was, literally, a company man, a pragmatic, professional soldier whose entire career was a calculated ascent through the ranks of the East India Company's military establishment. His background was one of grinding, professional competence, a stark contrast to the brilliant but erratic genius of his French nemesis, Lally. Coote had first arrived in India as a junior officer in the 39th Regiment of Foot. He was a creature of discipline and detail, possessing an almost terrifying internal stillness. Where others saw the chaos and disorder of war in the subcontinent, Coote saw only logistical problems to be solved and men to be systematically molded into instruments of unyielding obedience. His defining moment, prior to Wandiwash, was not a command victory, but his pivotal, if understated, role at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. While Robert Clive took the political and popular glory for that foundational victory, it was Coote, then a major, who provided the crucial, decisive military input. When Clive, crippled by doubt and the numerical superiority of his enemies, called a council of war and argued for delaying the attack, it was Coote who rose and delivered the sharp, uncompromising argument for immediate, aggressive action. He understood the psychological moment and the critical need to seize the initiative. His counsel swayed Clive, and the subsequent victory established the British on the path to empire. Yet, it was Clive who received the lion's share of the historical memory. Coote was relegated to the footnote of military precision, a pattern that would follow him throughout his career. This initial experience shaped Coote's unique military philosophy, a doctrine born of the specific environment of Indian warfare. He understood that in a theater where European forces were always outnumbered and often outmatched by the enemy's cavalry and local knowledge, victory could only be secured through unprecedented levels of endurance and discipline. He rejected the idea that British and Sepoy troops could not withstand the heat and the pressure to execute complex maneuvers under fire. His men were not trained to be heroic individuals. They were trained to be inhumanly rigid, unflinching automatons, capable of holding a perfect line while their comrades fell around them. This focus on discipline was considered by many of his peers to be suicidal. To hold a line thinly spread across open ground, to refuse to break formation, to delay firing until the enemy was within point-blank range, this required a level of trust in the command structure that few contemporary generals could instill. It was a cold, high-risk strategy, relying on the enemy's belief that any European force, faced with a determined attack, would eventually buckle under the strain. Coote's innovation was to ensure his force simply would not. He was a master of logistics and administration, obsessively focused on the health, supply, and internal order of his army. He realized that a well-fed, properly paid, and strictly disciplined Sepoy regiment was a far more reliable fighting instrument than a demoralized and undersupplied European battalion. This methodical, almost obsessive professionalism set him apart from the more erratic, glory-seeking commanders who often dominated the East India Company's higher echelons. Coote arrived in the Carnatic not as a charismatic savior, but as a severe, demanding pragmatist, armed with an unconventional conviction that the British could win not through clever feints or massive cavalry charges, but through the unbreakable willpower of the infantry line. He had been appointed precisely because his peers recognized his icy competence as the only antidote to the brilliant, aggressive fire of Lally. The stage was set for a clash between two diametrically opposed military philosophies: the flamboyant, aristocratic aggression of the French versus the unflinching, almost monastic discipline of Eyre Coote. The war was no longer about territory, it was about which man's genius, the fire of Lally or the ice of Coote, would prove superior under the strain of battle. Eyre Coote's military philosophy was not taught in the hallowed halls of European war colleges. It was a brutal, pragmatic doctrine forged in the searing heat of the Indian sun and under the pressure of constant, crippling numerical disparity. This was his whispered genius, the radical realization that since the British could never match the enemy in sheer quantity, they had to achieve an unprecedented quality of fighting that bordered on the mechanical. His entire system was built upon the ruthless, uncompromising belief that in the chaos of battle, the only thing that mattered was unflinching, systemic obedience. For Coote, the human element, fear, fatigue, individual heroism, was a weakness to be purged. He sought to transform his European regulars and, critically, his native Sepoy regiments into reliable, precise instruments of war, capable of executing complex maneuvers under fire with machine-like repetition. In the 18th century, the standard battlefield doctrine relied on musketry volleys and bayonet charges, but the discipline often frayed under stress, especially when facing the swift, overwhelming cavalry attacks common in Indian armies, often backed by French artillery. Coote's response was not to invent new maneuvers, but to perfect the basics to an inhumane degree. Drill was conducted relentlessly, far beyond the standards of the day, focusing on one core principle: holding the line. He drilled his men to resist the primal urge to fire too soon. The tactical advantage of musketry lay in the devastating shock of a close-range, massed volley. But to achieve this, the men had to hold their position and their nerve while the enemy charged towards them, waiting until the attacking force was within mere dozens of yards. This was a psychological gauntlet that broke most troops. Coote's training was designed to break the fear before the battle, replacing it with the muscle memory of command. Furthermore, Coote understood that the company's native infantry, the Sepoys, were not merely auxiliaries. They were essential. While other commanders often treated them as second-class troops, Coote elevated their training and ensured they were compensated fairly, though still subject to his draconian disciplinary code. By rigorously drilling the Sepoy regiments to the same mechanical standard as his European regulars, he created a unified, cohesive fighting force. He integrated them fully into the main line of battle, knowing that their endurance in the climate, combined with European firearms and training, offered a hybrid military power the French had yet to counter. This focus on internal discipline had a profound psychological effect on the enemy. In Indian warfare, a charging army expected the defending line to wobble, to offer a ragged fire, and eventually to break under pressure. The sight of Coote's lines, perfectly straight, motionless, absorbing the shock of a charge while holding their fire until the last possible moment, before unleashing a simultaneous, thunderous volley, was profoundly demoralizing. It signaled to the enemy that they were facing a different kind of army, one that defied the known limits of human fear and endurance. Coote's doctrine was a high-risk gamble. It was predicated on the perfect execution of every order. If a single regiment faltered, if a crucial sepoy company panicked and broke, the entire thin line would shatter, and the numerical superiority of Lally's force would instantly engulf the British. Yet, Coote had sufficient faith in the severity of his training and the enforced obedience of his men that he was willing to commit to this suicidal rigidity. His strategy for Wandiwash would not rely on clever flanks or surprise ambushes, but on a terrifying, almost stubborn refusal to be defeated, a triumph of the human will, paradoxically achieved through the suppression of individual will. This was the foundation of the impossible victory to come. The barren plain near Wandiwash became not just a battlefield, but a collision point of two fundamentally opposed worldviews, embodied by the men who commanded the armies. On one side stood Comte de Lally, the epitome of aristocratic, aggressive genius, a man convinced of his own military destiny and the inherent superiority of French arms. On the other stood Eyre Coote, the professional pragmatist, an officer whose ambition was cloaked in cold, methodical discipline, trusting less in charisma and more in the geometry of the perfectly aligned line. The confrontation was not just between French and British, it was a clash of egos and empires, a duel between two types of military leadership. Lally, the flamboyant Irishman in French service, carried the historical weight of the ancien regime. He was hot-headed, prone to rages, and often alienated his allies and subordinates, yet his military brilliance was undeniable. He had proven his strategic acumen by successfully sweeping away British influence and placing Madras under siege. His confidence, bordering on arrogance, was his strength and his greatest flaw. He saw the impending battle not as a calculated risk, but as the inevitable final stroke that would establish him as the conqueror of the richest region on earth. Lally's plan was to leverage his numerical superiority, particularly in heavy artillery and cavalry, to crush the British forces quickly and decisively, demonstrating the full, majestic power of the French crown. Coote, meanwhile, represented the emerging face of the British Empire, the cold, calculating efficiency of the commercial military machine. His decisions were driven by logistics and measured discipline, devoid of the theatrical flourish Lally so favored. Coote knew that to defeat Lally, he could not simply outmaneuver him, he had to break Lally's confidence in his own overwhelming force. He understood that Lally, for all his genius, was predictable in his aggressive reliance on heavy initial shock. The strategic maneuvers leading to Wandiwash were a study in this contrast. Lally, focused on recovering the recently captured French fort of Wandiwash itself, allowed Coote to dictate the ground. Coote, having lifted a minor siege and secured the fort, deliberately positioned his army on the open plain, where Lally's large cavalry forces and concentrated artillery could theoretically devastate them. This act was deliberately provocative, a challenge that screamed, "We are here, we are outnumbered, and we dare you to charge us." Coote's choice of ground was an immense gamble. It sacrificed all natural protection, relying entirely on the discipline of his troops to absorb the shock of the French assault. His entire strategy rested on the premise that Lally, seeing the small British force exposed and seemingly vulnerable, would commit his forces to a frontal attack with overconfidence, thus playing directly into the hands of Coote's rigid defensive doctrine. For Lally, the sight of the small British line drawn up for battle must have seemed like a gift. The field was clear, his artillery could fire without impediment, and his formidable cavalry, commanded by the Marquis de Bussy-Castelnau, was perfectly positioned for a devastating flank attack. The French general saw a quick, glorious end to the war in the Carnatic. He believed Coote was either tactically naive or desperately cornered, and his assessment was fatally shaped by his own ego. He simply could not imagine that the smaller, seemingly less experienced British force could hold out against the fleur-de-lis. Thus, the day dawned on two armies, led by two men with opposing views of war. Lally, convinced of victory by weight and aggression, and Coote, convinced of victory by precision and the psychological warfare of unflinching stillness. Their clash at Wandiwash was not just about control of a fort, but a definitive trial of fire to determine which form of imperial power, the charismatic, aristocratic force of France or the cold, professional discipline of Britain, would ultimately dominate the vast continent of India. To truly appreciate the nature of the gamble Eyre Coote was taking at Wandiwash, one must look back at the humiliating precedents, the collective memory of failure that haunted the British military presence in India. Coote's small, exposed line was not just facing the French, it was fighting against the deep-seated historical and psychological expectation that, in a conventional open-field battle against numerically superior forces, especially those backed by formidable cavalry, the British line was supposed to break. The core of this expectation lay in two major factors: the inherent limitations of European infantry in the Indian environment and the terrifying power of the Maratha and Mysore cavalry forces, often allied with the French. Firstly, the British European troops suffered terribly from the climate, disease, and logistics. A European regiment in India was rarely at full strength, and the quality of the recruits, often drawn from the poorest classes, was notoriously inconsistent. The rigors of a campaign often left the men exhausted, their morale fragile. Previous engagements had shown that when the initial shock of a large-scale charge was sustained for too long, or when a flank was severely pressed, the thin red line, a formation dependent on the cohesion of every man, would dissolve into panicked flight. The officers who commanded these men often felt, with good reason, that they were operating with a fundamental flaw baked into their forces. Secondly, and more critically, was the issue of cavalry. The French, often utilizing the services of their brilliant ally, the Marquis de Bussy-Castelnau, commanded a formidable force of European and Indian cavalry. The standard British response to a massed cavalry attack was to form a hollow square, a defensive formation that sacrificed all offensive capability to present a wall of bayonets. While a square could repel cavalry, it was slow, vulnerable to artillery fire, and effectively immobilized the entire force. In earlier skirmishes and engagements throughout the Carnatic Wars, British field commanders had frequently been pinned down, harried, and forced to retreat by fast-moving, overwhelming enemy forces that utilized their superior mobility. The classic example of failure occurred when a British force, attempting to relieve a besieged garrison, was compelled to form squares too early, allowing the enemy to maneuver around them, cut their supply lines, and force a humiliating withdrawal without ever engaging in a pitched battle. The memory of these costly withdrawals and the near-out at various minor engagements preceding Wandiwash confirmed a prevailing belief that a British-led army could not stand in the open field against a determined French-Indian combined force and survive. Lally knew this history intimately. His strategy for Wandiwash was built upon this established tactical precedent. He did not anticipate needing a clever trap or a complex maneuver. He simply intended to apply overwhelming force, a combination of concentrated French artillery and the weight of his cavalry, to exceed the psychological breaking point of Coote's line. The thin, rigid line that Coote drew up on the plain was, therefore, not just a deployment, it was a deliberate defiance of history. It was a formation that deliberately invited the crushing weight of the French attack, betting everything on the revolutionary discipline Coote had hammered into his troops. Lally fully expected Coote to either retreat or fall into the predictable defensive square. Coote's refusal to do either, his sheer, stubborn insistence on maintaining the thin line, was regarded by the French not as a tactic, but as a fatal act of arrogance. In the moments before the first French cannonade, the men in the Redcoats were fighting two enemies: the French army in front of them, and the ingrained, terrifying knowledge that they were standing in a position where their predecessors had invariably broken and fled. Coote's genius had to overcome not only the French but also the burden of British military history in India. The final act of the drama unfolded under the harsh, unfiltered light of the Indian morning. This was Act 3, the impossible climax, the moment where all of Coote's training, all of Lally's aggression, and the fate of two empires were compressed into a single, terrifying engagement. The day was January 22, 1760. The field of Wandiwash lay before the armies, a vast, flat expanse of baked earth and thorn scrub, utterly devoid of natural cover, making it a perfect stage for the French to deploy their overwhelming might. Coote's deployment was his first act of defiance. He arrayed his small army, approximately 1,900 European troops and 2,100 sepoys, in a meticulous, extended thin line. This was the height of military risk, a formation that prioritized the delivery of maximum simultaneous firepower but offered almost no defensive depth. His flanks were anchored by the small fort of Wandiwash and a low, rocky mound, a tumulus, which, while insignificant in height, would prove crucial. Coote was effectively daring Lally to strike at the center of his forces, demonstrating absolute faith in the unbreakable nerve of his men. Across the field, the French army, commanded by Lally and the Marquis de Bussy-Castelnau, appeared immense, boasting roughly 2,200 European soldiers, 1,300 excellent Indian cavalry, and a massive contingent of sepoys and local auxiliaries, perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 men in total. The French line was a picture of formidable aggression, their left flank particularly heavy with cavalry and their artillery massed for a devastating preliminary barrage. The battle opened with the artillery duel. Lally's guns, heavier and more numerous, commenced a fierce bombardment designed to shatter the British lines before the infantry could close. The smoke immediately thickened the air, merging with the dust kicked up by the French advance, shrouding the plain in a haze of copper and grey. This was a critical test of Coote's discipline. The incessant roar, the geysers of dirt and shrapnel exploding among the ranks, were designed to force a panicked retreat or the hasty formation of squares. Yet, the British line stood unwavering. The sepoy regiments, trained to a degree previously unseen, absorbed the casualties without flinching, holding their alignment with unnatural stiffness. Coote had trained them for this precise moment, to endure the horror of anticipation. His officers, moving calmly along the ranks, enforced the cardinal rule: hold the position, do not break formation, reserve fire. Lally, seeing the British line hold under fire, read this stillness as an opportunity, not a threat. He was convinced that the British were simply pinned down and demoralized. Confident in his numerical advantage, he signaled the advance of his main columns. The sheer visual spectacle of the French masses moving forward was overwhelming, a tide of blue and white advancing to engulf the thin red line. The first major confrontation was not an infantry clash, but a crucial struggle for the aforementioned tumulus. This small, insignificant height offered a commanding position for artillery observation and deployment. Both sides realized its value. Coote, acting with characteristic swiftness, had secured it early. Lally, infuriated by this oversight, ordered a detachment to seize it. The fight for the mound was sharp and desperate, a microcosm of the larger battle, but the British successfully held their ground. This small, forgotten hill, drenched in blood and dust, proved to be the pivotal piece of terrain that allowed Coote's artillery to operate effectively and deny the French a key tactical advantage from the start. The stage was set for the main event, the frontal infantry clash, preceded by the French cavalry's attempt to turn the British flank. The smoke, the dust, the roar of the guns, it all combined to create an atmosphere of apocalyptic tension. Every man knew that the next minutes would determine whether the British Empire in India would survive the morning. The preliminary artillery fire had failed to break the British formation, merely slicing holes in the ranks that were instantly and stoically closed. This failure only served to confirm Comte de Lally's central belief, that a more direct, overwhelming application of force was necessary to shatter the tenacious Red Line. His strategy hinged on a classic pincer movement, but the true hammer blow was reserved for his elite cavalry. Lally committed his most formidable troops, a mass of French European cavalry supported by several thousand swift and deadly irregular Indian horsemen, to a concentrated, devastating charge against the British right flank. This was the moment the battle was supposed to end. Cavalry, the swift and terrifying arm of 18th-century warfare, possessed immense psychological power. A determined charge, delivered at speed, could turn an infantry line into a panicked rout in mere seconds. Lally was confident that even Coote's rigorously disciplined troops would succumb to the primal terror of thundering hooves and flashing sabers. The sight was overwhelming. The ground began to tremble not from the cannon, but from the coordinated gallop of the French horse, kicking up enormous clouds of dust that momentarily obscured the sun. The sound was a terrifying, low roar that swelled into a deafening thunder as the mass of riders closed the distance. This was the acid test of Coote's doctrine. He had gambled the entire fate of the British Empire on the belief that his infantry, sepoy and European alike, could absorb this shock without moving. Coote had anticipated this precise maneuver. He knew that the charge's success relied on the infantry breaking ranks before the cavalry reached striking distance. His orders were simple, yet demanded an almost inhuman level of cold resolve. The front ranks were to maintain their perfectly aligned formation and hold their fire. To fire too soon was to empty the muskets and leave the men defenseless against the closing horsemen. To flinch was to open a gap and allow the cavalry to flood the line, leading to a total massacre. The moment stretched into an agonizing eternity. Every nerve in the British line screamed for action, for the release of the musket fire that promised temporary safety. But Coote's officers, moving with grim authority, enforced the order. The French cavalry thundered into the closest range, the riders' faces becoming discernible, the glint of steel terrifyingly clear. They fully expected the line to dissolve, to see the redcoats scatter. Then, at Coote's command, which rang out across the din of the field, or more likely, at the predetermined, final distance, the entire British front rank dropped to one knee, presenting a low wall of bayonets and muskets. The remaining ranks leveled their weapons over their comrades' heads. In a single, deafening, perfectly synchronized roar, the order was given, fire. The resultant volley was not the ragged, staggered effort of a panicked army, but a single, unified thunderclap of fire and smoke. Delivered at near point-blank range, it was utterly devastating. The sheer density of musket balls tore into the massed ranks of the French and Indian cavalry. Horses and riders crumpled into a horrific, tangled heap, bringing down the ranks behind them in a catastrophic chain reaction. The effect was immediate and psychologically terminal. The front of the charge had been not merely repelled, but annihilated. The surviving horsemen, witnessing the sudden, violent destruction of their comrades and unnerved by the unnatural stillness and precision of the British line, wavered. Their momentum was broken, their confidence shattered. Before Lally could reorganize this elite force, the British line delivered a second, equally disciplined volley. The French cavalry, the pride of Lally's army, turned and fled the field in disorder, their bodies and morale broken by a discipline they had not believed possible. This was the battle's first, definitive turning point. The hammer blow had not just failed, it had recoiled violently, proving that Coote's high-risk, rigid doctrine was not suicidal, but a form of tactical genius. The myth of the invincible French cavalry charge had just died in the dust of Wandiwash. The rout of the French cavalry was a massive psychological victory, but it was not the end of the battle. It was merely the preamble to the supreme test of Eyre Coote's revolutionary military doctrine. The full weight of the French and Allied Indian infantry now advanced, pressing the British line along its entire length. This was the moment of ultimate commitment, where the rigid discipline instilled by Coote was pitted against the human instinct for self-preservation, fatigue, and fear. Lally, furious at the failure of his cavalry's hammer blow, threw his best European battalions, the finest in the French service, trained in the aggressive, shock-based tactics of continental warfare, directly against the British centre. The density of the French columns was terrifying, designed to simply overwhelm the thin red line through sheer mass. This was a battle of geometry and willpower, a deep, powerful French column aimed at punching through a thin, brittle British line. Conventional wisdom dictated that the column should succeed. It had the weight, the momentum, and the numerical advantage in any localized point of contact. But Coote's line was no longer conventional. It was an instrument of unprecedented, almost unnatural discipline. As the French columns closed, the noise became a physical force, the rhythmic drumming, the shouts of French officers, and the relentless pounding of feet. The British line, a mixture of European regiments and the sepoys of the company's service, seemed utterly motionless, a wall of faded scarlet and brown against the advancing blue and white. They were fighting in stifling heat, under the oppressive weight of their heavy uniforms, yet they held their positions with a stiffness that defied the tropical conditions. Coote had trained his men to operate as a single, fluid unit of destruction. When the French reached the critical range, closer than any sane general would dare, the firing began not as a chaotic surge of desperate individuals, but as a meticulously controlled sequence. The British doctrine was based on sequential platoon firing, delivered by ranks. A portion of the line would fire, creating a devastating, localized effect, while the rest of the line maintained their muskets loaded and leveled, ready to instantly plug any gap or deliver the next shattering volley. This was the genius of Coote's method. It ensured a continuous, high-volume fire that compensated for the numerical disadvantage. The impact on the dense French columns was horrific. A column's strength lay in its mass, but this mass also made it an ideal target. Coote's sequential firing ripped bloody holes through the tightly packed ranks. The French soldiers, while brave, were not trained to withstand this kind of systematic, continuous attrition. They were trained to close and fight. The British were trained to destroy from a distance with precision fire. The pivotal moment arrived when a flanking French sepoy regiment, attempting to turn the British left, managed to push close to the small rock mound Coote had secured. The British command was immediately informed. In a move that showcased the swift, cold efficiency of Coote's leadership, he detached a small but formidable reserve force, Company European Infantry, with crisp, decisive orders to drive the flanking force back. These men, far from being a ceremonial reserve, were fresh, disciplined, and delivered their attack with devastating focus. The French sepoys, already nervous and unsupported, were quickly routed. Crucially, throughout this localized crisis, the main British line did not waver or thin out. Coote's training had ensured that the departure and redeployment of the reserve did not cause a ripple of panic or hesitation in the main body. The soldiers trusted the system, they trusted that their comrades would return, and they trusted their own training to hold the line in the interim. This was the difference. The French fought with fire and dash, the British fought with geometry and trust in their system. The stress finally became too much for the French. Lally's best battalions were being systematically whittled down, their officers falling as precise British fire picked them out. Their aggressive columns, unable to punch through the resilient line and facing a continuous sheet of destructive musketry, began to stall. They had expended their initial shock, and found themselves facing an enemy who refused to follow the rules of defeat. The sight of the thin red line, still standing, still firing with controlled fury, despite hours of bombardment and direct assault, shattered the French morale. The psychological breakthrough was complete. Lally's men had been taught that the British line was fragile. Coote had shown them it was unbreakable. The French columns, having absorbed too much punishment and failing to achieve the critical breakthrough, began a slow, hesitant withdrawal. Coote had won the battle not by outmaneuvering Lally, but by forcing Lally's superior numbers to break themselves against the unprecedented human wall of British discipline. The sun beat down on a field where the fleur-de-lis was in retreat, a victory secured by the silent, resolute, and totally unexpected defiance of the men in red. The great infantry clash had reached its bloody, devastating stalemate, but the battle for Wandiwash was also being fought in a far more technical and unforgiving arena, the duel of artillery. While the infantry lines held, the cannons continued their tireless work, pounding the ranks and dictating the flow of the fight. This technical superiority was where Lally had held the initial, crushing advantage, yet it was ultimately exploited and neutralized by Coote's tactical focus. Lally had deployed a powerful concentration of heavy French guns, designed to inflict massive casualties and suppress the British infantry before the assault. For a time, the French artillery achieved its grim objective, raining down iron onto Coote's exposed formations. However, Coote's genius lay not just in discipline but in adaptability and the ruthless prioritization of targets. He recognized that while his infantry absorbed the punishment, his own artillery, lighter, more mobile field guns, could be used offensively to silence the French batteries rather than merely counter-battery fire. Coote directed his gunners, who had been trained to match the infantry's rigor, to focus their fire relentlessly on the French artillery positions. This was an arduous, dangerous task, but the accuracy and sustained rate of fire from the British guns began to tell. Carriage wheels were splintered, gun crews decimated, and slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying French cannonade began to slacken. This gradual silencing of the superior French firepower was a crucial element in Coote's success, diminishing Lally's most powerful advantage and easing the psychological pressure on the holding infantry. More immediate and tactical than the general cannonade was the struggle for a seemingly insignificant piece of terrain, a low, rocky hillock or tumulus positioned near the flank of the British line. In the flat, exposed terrain of Wandiwash, even this small rise became a vital military feature. It offered a crucial vantage point for observation and a stable platform from which to command the field and, critically, sight light artillery pieces that could deliver flanking fire. Coote, demonstrating his meticulous attention to detail, had secured this tumulus early in the deployment. Lally, however, quickly recognized the threat posed by this piece of high ground, especially after the failure of his cavalry charge left his flank exposed. Lally ordered a mixed detachment of French grenadiers and sepoys to seize the tumulus and establish a counterposition that would threaten Coote's line. The fight that erupted on and around the rocky outcrop was characterized by savage, close-quarters combat, a brutal break from the measured firing of the main lines. The French force, desperate to dislodge the British, threw themselves at the position. For a terrifying few minutes, the British defenders wavered under the ferocity of the assault. The situation became critical when the French counterattack successfully captured an abandoned artillery piece near the tumulus. Leading this charge was none other than the highly experienced and capable French second-in-command, Marquis de Castelnau. His presence electrified the French troops, pushing them to a renewed, furious offensive. However, Coote's response was immediate and decisive. He ordered a fresh sepoy battalion, supported by a contingent of European troops, to launch a sharp, disciplined counterattack. The ensuing engagement was swift and bloody. During the desperate melee, the British delivered a devastating blow. Castelnau was captured. The loss of their senior field commander sent a visible ripple of panic and confusion through the French ranks fighting for the tumulus. Demoralized and deprived of Bussier's inspiring leadership, the French attack collapsed. The British not only recaptured the high ground but solidified their position. The capture of the tumulus, and more importantly, the capture of Lally's most trusted subordinate, was a catastrophic psychological and tactical blow. It signaled the French command's loss of control and gave Coote permanent mastery over the centerground of the battle. The duel of artillery was won, and the flanking threat was neutralized, setting the stage for the final, devastating collapse of the French main line. The tide of battle at Wandiwash had not turned in a spectacular, instantaneous rush. It had been slowly, methodically, and agonizingly dismantled by the cold, precise machinery of Eyre Coote's army. The failure of the cavalry charge and the loss of the vital tumulus and, crucially, the capture of Castelnau, Lally's most capable subordinate, combined to create a scenario Lally had never truly contemplated: systematic, unanswerable failure. Comte de Lally, watching the proceedings from his command post, experienced a collapse not just of his battle plan, but of his overwhelming confidence. He had arrived in India with the conviction of a conqueror, a general who saw the British as merely a commercial nuisance to be swept away by superior French military science. Now, he was watching that science being utterly defeated by what he must have seen as mere colonial stubbornness and discipline. His grand, aggressive strategy had been reduced to nothing but a bloody, wasteful collision against an unbreakable defensive wall. The French European infantry columns, which had advanced with such confidence, were now in a state of growing paralysis. They were not rooting in panic, they were stalling in bewilderment. Coote's relentless, accurate, sequential fire had inflicted a constant, unsustainable rate of attrition. Every time the French columns paused to return fire, they were hit by another disciplined volley. They had failed to achieve the necessary shock, and without that momentum, the column formation became a liability, a dense, easily targetable mass. The moment of realization for Lally was agonizingly slow. He had already lost his elite horsemen and bussy, and now his infantry was refusing to advance further into the hail of lead. The final, devastating psychological blow was delivered when one of the French allied sepoy regiments, positioned close to the center, finally broke under the stress. Their morale, unlike that of Coote's troops, was not rooted in the same rigid, systemic discipline, and seeing the destruction of the French regulars and the flight of the cavalry, their resolve evaporated. They turned and fled the field, exposing a critical gap in the French line. Lally, now frantic, personally rode into the fray in a desperate attempt to rally the fleeing sepoys and prevent the collapse of his center. This act, characteristic of his fiery courage but strategically reckless, was too late. The gap was too wide, and the morale contagion spread quickly. Coote, observing Lally's personal, desperate intervention, a sure sign that the French command structure was dissolving, immediately ordered his infantry to press their advantage, maintaining the sustained rate of fire that had been so effective. Faced with a crumbling Allied wing, decimated ranks in his European battalions, and the capture of his second-in-command, Lally was forced to confront the impossible truth: the battle was definitively lost. His attempt at total annihilation had resulted in his own army's near annihilation. He had to save the core of his European force to fight another day. With a heart undoubtedly heavy with rage and humiliation, Lally gave the order to withdraw. It was not a hasty, panicked rout, but a slow, forced retreat, covered by the remaining French cavalry and artillery. It was a withdrawal designed to preserve the physical structure of his army, but it could not preserve the psychological structure of his command. He left behind his artillery, his baggage, and hundreds of casualties. The French army was no longer a conquering force, it was a defeated army desperately seeking to escape. Wandiwash was not just a defeat for France, it was a brutal, personal refutation of Lally's strategic belief system, a blow from which his reputation, and the French cause in India, would never recover. The retreat of the French army was a final, stark image of defeat, leaving behind a battlefield soaked in the blood of both European and Indian soldiers. Wandiwash was not a close-run thing, it was, by the standards of 18th-century warfare in India, a devastating annihilation of French military capability. The immediate aftermath was defined by the grim task of counting the cost and cataloguing the spoils, actions that confirmed the sheer, decisive nature of Eyre Coote's victory. The British losses were significant, a testament to the fierce fighting endured by the Thin Red Line, but they were dwarfed by the French catastrophe. Lally's army had been utterly broken as an effective fighting force. The physical evidence of the French collapse lay scattered across the plain. Heavy artillery pieces, vital for the prosecution of the war, lay abandoned, their wheels shattered or their carriages overturned. The loss of these guns crippled Lally's capacity for siege warfare, the very tool he had used so effectively to threaten Madras. More devastating than the equipment loss was the personnel disaster. Coote's forces captured a staggering number of prisoners, including the prized scalp of Marquis de Bussy-Castelnau, Lally's second-in-command and the man who had been the most successful French strategist in India before Lally's arrival. Bussy's capture was both a psychological and tactical blow that could not be easily replaced, robbing the French of their most consistent field general. The flight of the Allied sepoy regiments confirmed a deeper, more troubling defeat for Lally, the loss of local prestige. In India, military strength was inextricably linked to reputation, and a general who was seen to be invincible could easily command vast local support. The utter defeat of Lally, the man who had nearly taken Madras, signaled to the local rulers that the French tide had definitively turned. The local allies, always pragmatic and shifting their allegiance to the side that demonstrated superior strength, began to peel away from the French cause, sealing Lally's fate. For Coote, the aftermath was a complex mix of professional vindication and grim necessity. His men, exhausted but triumphant, had proven his doctrine of discipline was viable. They had faced overwhelming odds and won by sheer, unflinching resolve. The battlefield cleanup was brutal. The wounded were tended, the dead buried, and the vast stores of French material, powder, supplies, and weapons were quickly catalogued and secured. The physical victory had been achieved, but Coote, the consummate professional, immediately understood the strategic consequences. Wandiwash was not the final act of the war, but it was the turning point of no return. Lally had been soundly beaten in a pitched battle, a scenario he had explicitly sought, using the numbers he believed guaranteed victory. The French army, scattered and demoralized, was forced to retreat north, their strategic goals reduced from conquest to mere survival. Their last remaining major stronghold was Pondicherry, the capital of French India, which now stood completely exposed. Coote, energized by the success of his methods, refused to allow Lally any respite. He immediately pressed his advantage, initiating a relentless pursuit that denied Lally the time and space to regroup, rearm, or rally his fleeing allies. The victory was written not just in the blood spilled at Wandiwash, but in the swift, uncompromising operational tempo that Coote maintained in the following weeks, transforming a decisive battle win into a total strategic triumph. The smoke settled over the plain, but the fire of Coote's relentless campaign was only just beginning to burn. The morning of January 22, 1760, did not feel like the dawn of a decisive victory. It felt like the prelude to a slaughter. The small British force assembled near the mud walls of Wandiwash gazed across a barren, scrub-dotted plain where the fate of a nascent empire would be decided. This dusty, insignificant corner of the Carnatic coast was, improbably, the hinge upon which the future of British India swung. For the men shivering beneath their patched uniforms, the arithmetic was grim and inescapable. They were heavily outnumbered, exhausted from months of relentless campaigning, and they were facing the finest military minds and the most formidable European-led forces the French could muster on the subcontinent. The British East India Company's Redcoats, flanked by their disciplined but regionally untested sepoy regiments, represented the last, desperate throw of the dice for London. Their opponents, commanded by the fearsome and famously arrogant Comte de Lally, were not just a larger army. They were a coalition of the most formidable indigenous rulers, backed by the best-trained French regulars, the legendary Regiment de Lally itself. Lally's mission was simple: crush the remaining British presence and secure India as a permanent French prize. He had been so successful, so relentless, that many in Madras already considered the cause lost. The French had seized the initiative, captured key ports, and had brought the entire British enterprise to the brink of utter ruin. To understand the sheer magnitude of the impossible odds facing the British, one must first grasp the stakes, not just in the Carnatic, but across the globe. This battle was not an isolated skirmish between trading rivals. It was the eastern front of the colossal 7 Years' War, a global conflagration that pitted the powers of Europe against each other for domination of trade routes, colonies, and resources. In Europe, Frederick the Great was clinging by his fingernails. On the high seas, the French navy still posed a potent threat. But in India, the financial heart of the Empire of Tomorrow, the situation was catastrophic. If Lally won this day, Britain would not just lose a few trading posts, they would lose the entire strategic advantage in the East. The massive wealth generated by Indian trade, the very economic fuel that powered the Royal Navy and financed Britain's wars in Europe, would be diverted into the French treasury. The victory of Wandiwash, if it were to happen, had to be total, and it had to be immediate. The atmosphere was thick with the dust of the plain and the weight of imperial destiny. The man who had brought them to this precipice, General Eyre Coote, was a man of quiet, cold calculation, not flamboyant inspiration. His tactics were not genius in the obvious, aggressive sense. They were genius in their methodical, almost brutal reliance on sustained discipline. As the French lines advanced, looking overwhelming and unstoppable, the odds against Coote's small army seemed to swell into an insurmountable wave. Every officer knew that Lally was relying on the standard weaknesses of a mixed company force. the lack of resolve in the Sepoys, the inevitable fatigue of the Europeans, and the inability of a small army to withstand the sheer weight of a massive frontal assault combined with a flanking cavalry charge. The French plan, as seen by their confident commanders, was a textbook maneuver designed to turn this day into a massacre, a final, humiliating punctuation mark on the history of the British East India Company. The question hanging in the scorching Indian air, a question whispered in the anxious prayers of the rank and file, was not whether they could win, but whether they could survive the morning. How, against this overwhelming power, against the full weight of Lally's ambition and Europe's best-trained regiments, could this small, isolated British force possibly halt the French tide, turn the tables of a global war, and save the British Empire in India? The answer lay in the forgotten genius of the man commanding the thin red line, and in the sheer, unprecedented discipline of the men he had trained for this very moment of impossible sacrifice. The victory at Wandiwash was not an isolated success. It was a strategic earthquake that fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the Indian subcontinent and, by extension, the British Empire. The immediate and long-term consequences of Eyre Coote's triumph moved far beyond the battlefield, securing for Britain what would ultimately be known as the jewel in the crown. The most immediate consequence was the complete paralysis of French offensive operations in India. Comte de Lally, deprived of his best officers, his vital artillery, and the morale of his native allies, was forced into a desperate, grinding retreat. Coote, a master of logistics and relentless pursuit, gave Lally no rest. He transformed the battlefield victory into a campaign victory. He immediately invested the last major French stronghold, the coastal city of Pondicherry. Pondicherry was the heart of French India, the administrative and commercial capital. Its capture was essential for total British dominance. The defeat at Wandiwash meant Lally could not muster a credible field army to relieve the city. The siege, which began in March 1760 and lasted for months, was a direct and inevitable consequence of Coote's tactical success. When Pondicherry finally fell in January 1761, a year almost to the day after Wandiwash, the French presence in India was effectively extinguished. The French East India Company was ruined, their last bases demolished, and their military power neutralized. This triumph secured for the British East India Company uncontested supremacy in the Carnatic region. This was the critical tipping point. From being one of several competing European powers, the British were now the sole European power capable of projecting force across the vast majority of southern India. This territorial and military control gave the company an immense economic advantage. The vast revenue streams, which had been at risk of collapse, as discussed in Act 1, were now secure and, more importantly, expanding. This financial security stabilized the company's stock in London and provided the critical capital needed to sustain Britain's war effort against France across the globe. Wandiwash, therefore, became the guarantee of British India. While Robert Clive's victory at Plassey, 1757, had opened the door to Bengal, Coote's victory closed the door on the French challenge to British power. It eliminated the only other European entity capable of successfully contesting control of the subcontinent. By ensuring British victory in the Third Carnatic War, Coote inadvertently set the stage for the next 2 centuries of British imperial rule. The vast, rich domain of India was secured, becoming the foundation of Britain's global prestige, wealth, and strategic depth. The strategic earthquake rippled all the way back to Europe. The French loss of India was a fatal blow to their finances during the 7 Years' War, severely hampering their ability to fund their continental allies and naval operations. The wealth that Coote secured for Britain helped finance the final years of the global conflict, contributing directly to Britain's emergence as the world's foremost imperial and naval power following the Treaty of Paris in 1763. It was a victory earned in the dusty heat of the Carnatic that changed the balance of power across the globe, permanently securing the jewel in the crown long before the crown was ever aware of its full worth. For a man who had secured the most lucrative territorial prize in the British Empire, Eyre Coote's subsequent career was marked by a disheartening, often bitter, trajectory. The narrative of the forgotten genius begins not with his death, but almost immediately after his impossible victory at Wandiwash. Despite his monumental achievement, Coote was immediately enveloped in the toxic, corrosive atmosphere of political maneuvering and administrative jealousy that characterized the East India Company. The men who ran the company were merchants and administrators first, and they viewed their military leaders with deep suspicion, seeing them as potential rivals for political power and wealth. Coote's cold, demanding competence and lack of aristocratic charisma did him no favors in the halls of power. He was a professional soldier who often spoke with brutal candor, openly criticizing the corruption, incompetence, and self-serving nature of the company's civil officials. This honesty earned him powerful, entrenched enemies who sought to minimize his influence and diminish his glory. The controversy that followed Wandiwash was not about his generalship, but about finance and credit. The company men, unwilling to accept the full cost of the war or grant Coote the lavish recognition he deserved, often challenged his expenditures and appointments. There were veiled threats of court-martial and endless, frustrating inquiries into his conduct, not for tactical failure, but for trivial breaches of protocol or alleged overspending. The very bureaucracy that Coote had saved tried constantly to trip him up. He was eventually recalled to England, a common practice for company generals, where he received some recognition, but never the towering status afforded to the more politically adept Robert Clive. Coote's moment of high command was brief, and his immense service was quickly relegated to the historical background by the more sensational tales of wealth extraction and political intrigue that dominated the company narrative. However, his later career was marked by one last, crucial service that underscores his unrelenting professionalism. Coote returned to India years later, this time to face an even more formidable foe, Hyder Ali of Mysore, a brilliant, aggressive military leader whose new, powerful army posed a threat far greater than the French had ever managed. In the Second Anglo-Mysore War, 1780–1784, Coote, now an older, more infirm man, once again proved his mettle in moments of desperate crisis. His victory at the Battle of Porto Novo in 1781, against a massive Mysorean army and under grueling conditions, was another extraordinary feat of generalship, saving the British forces from annihilation and temporarily stabilizing the company's position in the south. Yet, this later triumph came at a devastating personal cost. The years of relentless campaigning, the oppressive climate, and the constant political friction wore him down. He suffered greatly from illness, and his return voyages were often plagued by ill health. Coote's final years were a painful, ongoing struggle against both his physical ailments and the persistent lack of full official recognition. Eyre Coote ultimately died in India in 1783, exhausted and likely broken by the political machinations that constantly overshadowed his military achievements. His legacy was tragically two-tiered: a military genius who secured Britain's hold on India through unprecedented tactical discipline, and a forgotten man whose victories were consistently minimized by the political establishment he served. He won an empire but lost the recognition of history, becoming the quintessential forgotten general. The dust settled on Wandiwash, the French corps evaporated at Pondicherry, and the ensuing years saw Eyre Coote marginalized by the very company he saved. But the enduring legacy of Coote and his impossible victory transcends his forgotten status. It lies in the fundamental change he wrought upon military thought and the permanent securing of a global empire. Wandiwash was a victory that changed war forever, specifically in the crucible of colonial conflict. Prior to 1760, the accepted wisdom was that European tactical superiority lay in aggressive maneuvering and shock action, often relying heavily on cavalry and the individual prowess of aristocratic generals. Coote's triumph offered a severe, irrefutable counter-argument. He demonstrated that in conditions of numerical disadvantage and logistical strain, the defining realities of colonial warfare, the ultimate victor was not aggression, but uncompromising, mechanical discipline. Coote's doctrine established the template for the British Indian Army, a military entity that would grow to become the largest voluntary army in the world and the chief instrument of imperial control. His method of training sepoy regiments to the same rigid, unflinching standard as European regulars proved that indigenous troops, properly led and equipped, were capable of sustained, high-pressure execution under fire. This created a new kind of force, a hybrid, professional army whose core strength was its systemic obedience, not its charismatic leadership. The British military machine in India, for the next 2 centuries, was built upon the lessons Coote enforced at Wandiwash. The global impact was equally profound. The financial security derived from the Carnatic following Wandiwash was critical to Britain's overall victory in the 7 Years' War. Coote did not just win a battle, he provided the economic foundation for the Treaty of Paris, 1763, which confirmed Britain as the world's dominant colonial power. Without his victory, France would have retained India's wealth, drastically altering the outcome of the war and potentially shifting global power away from London. Yet, despite the magnitude of this achievement, Eyre Coote remains a hero relegated to the margins of history, eclipsed by the more flamboyant and politically savvy figures of Clive and Wellington. This act of historical omission is the final, sad confirmation of his narrative as the forgotten general. His genius was the kind that appealed to pragmatists and professionals, not to poets and politicians. His victories were attributed to the unflinching British character or the might of the company, rather than the severe, calculated tactical revolution he engineered. We remember Waterloo, a battle of generals and dramatic charges. We remember Trafalgar, a clash of fleets and national spirit. But we often forget Wandiwash, the quiet, disciplined, methodical destruction of French power in the East. It was the moment that secured the financial engine of the empire, the victory that confirmed the superiority of the professional military system over aristocratic Elan, and the event that irrevocably tied the destiny of India to the British crown. The legacy of Eyre Coote is therefore a stark and powerful one, a reminder that the most world-altering moments are often achieved not through dramatic heroics, but through cold, brilliant, unforgiving competence. He was the man who dared to make the impossible happen, and in doing so, he forever changed the composition of colonial armies, the balance of global power, and the course of British history.